Sadly, the church is in decline today.
If truth does not exist, we will not be able to live and function as civilized individuals in a society.
Students in the public education system at large of our nation are left with the impression God's irrelevant because he's never mentioned.
We sort of have national Alzheimer's. Here we are, the freest country that the world has ever seen, with more individual freedom and opportunity to choose what you want to do with your life and where you want to go to church. We have that, and we forgot how we got here.
So we're going to answer the question, why all the fuss?
Despite ever-increasing efforts to undermine the authority and accuracy of God's Word, the Bible stands firm.
Science and the Bible are inextricably linked.
We see evidence of incredible design.
God has made it incredibly clear.
Men, listen to me today. God has a calling on your life. Kids need you. Women need you. Our country needs fathers and responsible husbands today.
55 out of 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Bible-believing, church-attending Christians.
We have the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world. The Western world was successful because it was built upon biblical values.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you for being here. I have shortened this up. Excuse me. But some of it's just repetitive stuff that you saw yesterday. So, anyway, let's get going here. Racism or people groups, explaining red, yellow, black, and white. So where did this whole idea of human races even get going to begin with? Actually, we can thank this cast of characters here back in the 1800s for doing that. And of course, Charles Darwin was very famous for that, promoting the fact that there were lower races of humans that were closer to apes than the Anglo-European humans, which were supposed to be more evolved from the apes. And of course, he presented his whole paradigm of evolution, and actually also published a book on human evolution besides his book on the origin of species, which was heavily racist. And then Ernst Haeckel, who had his own theory of evolution in Germany, was also himself a racist and believed that humans had evolved from apes, and that there were lower groups of humans that were more primitive or closer to apes than the European white people. And of course, Thomas Huxley was like the PR agent for evolution and for racism, and he was the one that really widely publicized a lot of these ideas as well. And so this whole concept of human races, some being more superior to others, really got going in the 1800s, along with the theory of evolution. And so here is Charles Darwin's book, and we often just say, oh, Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, and some might even include the next part of the title, By Means of Natural Selection, but the title is actually much longer than that. And so look what the full title says, The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. And of course, according to Charles Darwin, evolution is a death-based system where the superior races in this massive struggle going on outcompete the lower, more inferior races, which justifies all kinds of violence, slavery, racism, all of these kind of things that subjugate humans. And what's really interesting, I made the comment yesterday that Stephen Jay Gould, who is one of the most famous 20th century evolutionists who died not all that long ago, but he would say stuff that was absolutely true, even though he wasn't a Christian. He didn't have a Christian worldview. He was an evolutionist, but he would say stuff that was completely candid and honest. And you remember the quote that I gave you yesterday where he admitted that the fossil record was lacking transitional forms, which is a major component of evolution that's actually missing, that Stephen Jay Gould admitted. But look at what he said about racism and evolution. Biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by orders of magnitude, following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. And so what is the basic concept of where all these supposedly advanced, what they call anatomically modern humans came from anyways? And it's all based on this out of Africa theory of evolution, which I got into more detail yesterday. And so you can watch, I can't remember which talk that was, but you can watch, excuse me, that one. And so anyways, according to evolutionists, anatomically modern humans evolved in Africa from chimpanzees, and then once they got sophisticated enough, they migrated out of Africa about 100,000 to 240,000 years ago. And so one of the main problems with this is that we have what are called archaic humans showing up in the fossil record, which are just humans with traits that I showed yesterday can still be found in modern humans. But anyways, these human fossils were found in China, supposedly, I don't accept these dates, but at 1.8 million years ago. Well, what are these people doing there in China if people didn't come out of Africa until 100,000 to 200,000 years ago? So you can see the evolutionists' own data contradicts their paradigms. And here again in Southeast Asian island, 1.7 million years ago. So if you have humans showing up allegedly 2.2 million years ago roughly in other parts of the world, how can you say they didn't come out of Africa until 100,000 to 200,000 years ago? It's complete nonsense. And this guy named Bruce R. Fenton, who is a science writer, actually noticed this, and he's not a Christian, he's not a creationist whatsoever, but he noticed this massive discrepancy between evolutionary theories and what the actual anthropological data showed. And he actually wrote a book called Into Africa, saying, no, humans evolved outside Africa, and then they just moved back into it. And so the evolutionary data is completely conflicting with their own paradigms. And of course, the reason the evolutionists pick Africa as the origin of humans, because that's the only place on Earth where we find chimpanzees, which they believe to be our closest relative. And I went into very excruciating detail on this last night, so you can go back and rewatch that talk if you want on that aspect of things. However, modern scientific data, including my own, which I actually published on 8 years ago now, I did a massive study comparing the chimpanzee genome to humans, and I determined that the chimpanzee genome compared to human is not more than 84% similar. And of course, evolutionists need close to a 99% DNA similarity between chimps and humans to get their evolutionary models, which are purely theoretical statistical models, in order to get humans to descend from a common ancestor about 6 million years ago. And about the same time I published that, Richard Buggs, who is a world-famous evolutionist in the UK at the University of London, Queen Mary, also did his own research using a completely different approach than I did, but yet he arrived at the same numbers. And he said this in a blog he put up on one of his personal websites. He said, the percentage of nucleotides in the human genome that have one-to-one exact matches in the chimpanzee genome was 84%. And so that was back in 2018 that he said that, roughly about the same time I published that paper that I just told you about. Well, 7 years later, which is last year in April, in the journal Nature, which is one of the top scientific journals in the world, there was a massive study done at the University of Seattle where they have a huge genome center there. They get millions of dollars funneled in there every year to do DNA sequencing for different projects. But in this particular project, they resequenced all of the 8 genomes from end to end. They call them telomere to telomere genome assemblies. And so they were very accurate, where they actually literally sequenced the entire 8 genomes. And they had done 8 genome sequencing before this, but none of them had been this accurate. And in their supplementary material, they didn't actually talk about this in the main paper, which was 17 pages long, because in my opinion, they wanted to bury this in the supplementary data so that no one would latch onto it. But anyway, so I read the paper, which was 17 pages, and it was just like, it was just pushing the evolutionary meme over and over again without really getting to what their data really said. What was the comparison of the chimp genome to human. And so they said, you can go to our supplementary material here, and they had a link to that, and it was 171 pages long, just like a book. And so I began diving into that, and I found a table where they actually posted the numbers where they had compared the chimpanzee genome to the human genome, and guess what? 84% DNA similarity. And so here I endured 7 years after 2018 being harassed by all these armchair evolutionists on YouTube. Tomkins is crazy, 84%. That's nonsense, And so here 7 years later, this paper is put out vindicating the same numbers I put out in 2018, as well as what Richard Buggs confirmed as well. So anyway, so that's very important. So why is that even important to begin with? Well, it's because, as I said, theoretical evolutionists need a 98.5 to 99% DNA genome similarity between chimps and humans to explain evolution with the known mutation rates that they've observed in humans, as far as in large human families, and also in chimpanzee populations out in the wild. To get to this evolutionary time frame of about 3 to 6 million years ago. Some of them, might even add a little bit more time to it to try and make it look more realistic, but still, 84% totally wrecks this whole paradigm, which is the bottom line. So where did humans come from to begin with? Well, as believers in Christ and knowing that the Word of God is infallible and sufficient in all things, we know that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, it says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them." And we had some great talks yesterday on what that means to be created in the image of God. So I won't get into that. But humans are unique. What did God say about all the other creatures? He said that they were created after their kind. But with humans, they're created in the image of God. So we are not just some other animal walking around on the face of the earth. We are the pinnacle of God's creation, created in his image. Well, let's look at some of the scientific data that actually supports this. So we know that in Genesis 3:20, it says, "And Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living." Well, why is this even important to modern genetics and trying to build, to look at what we can derive from what we call molecular clocks? And I'm talking about empirically based molecular clocks, not molecular clocks that are based on deep time or calibrated by fictional deep time, but real molecular clocks. And so what you inherit from your mother is the mitochondria, which is outside the nucleus in the cell. It's in the cytoplasm. It's this little energy factory out there, and you have hundreds of them in every cell. And each mitochondria, this little energy factory, has a circular piece of DNA that's about 16,000 bases long, or 16,000 DNA letters long. And so we know what the variability is in this mitochondrial genome by sequencing thousands of these from humans all over the earth, which has been going on since since the 1990s. Well, there's a guy named Nathaniel Jeanson. He actually got his PhD at Harvard. He worked for ICR for a number of years. Now he's at Answers in Genesis. And he began taking on this task of creating a molecular clock for this mitochondrial DNA sequence that's free, it's publicly available, your tax dollars have paid for it. But he said, hey, how many DNA differences should we see in the mitochondrial genome if it's, say, 50,000 years old? And so he said, well, we ought to see about 50 DNA differences. And then Nathaniel said, well, how much should we see if, say, 10,000 years old? And then he figured, well, we should probably see maybe close to about 10 DNA differences. And then he said, well, what do we actually see? Well, it turns out we actually see a little bit less than that, which matches up with a biblical time frame of 6,000 years from the present time to the beginning of creation. And we have these detailed chronologies in the Hebrew Bible, and as well as we were told, given these chronologies about Christ's ancestry as well. One of them goes back to Abraham, and the other one goes back to Adam. And so we know how old the earth is because we have these incredible chronologies and timelines. And I try and read through the Bible every year, and you get to these chronologies in different parts of the Old Testament, you're like, oh, this is so boring. But no, I'm amazed when I get to these chronologies because of the detail. It's just mind-blowing. I mean, how did this material survive all this time? Well, God preserves his holy word, and including all these timelines that you think are so boring when you're trying to read through the Old Testament. They're there for a reason. And as creation scientists, we love these things. So anyway, so Nathaniel Jeanson's mitochondrial DNA variation data matches up completely with a biblical timeline. But get this, secular guys did this years before Nathaniel Jeanson even did it. And so this paper was published in 1997 in the journal Nature Genetics, which is a top genetics journal, one of the top genetics journals in the entire world. And this guy, the secular conventional researcher, not a creation scientist whatsoever, did the exact same thing with the data that he had available in the 1990s. And it turns out that the data this guy produced was actually transferred over into the forensic science community and used for years by the FBI and all these intelligence agencies that are involved in solving crimes and doing DNA analysis on crime scenes. And so this data was completely valid. But anyway, so this guy said, okay, let me build a molecular clock based on all these mitochondrial DNA sequences from thousands of people around the world. And he said, I'm going to use an empirical model here. I'm not going to calibrate this with deep evolutionary time because that's totally fictional. So he said, well, how fast do populations grow? How many people do families have in these populations? And so he used empirical, what we call demographic data, or in other words, real data about how fast human populations grow and how we can look at this data empirically without all this evolutionary deep time, which is pure speculation. And he said this in the paper: using our empirical rate to calibrate the mitochondrial DNA molecular clock would result in an age of the mtDNA, and MRCA just stands for most recent common ancestor, or the first human woman, and he said of only 6,500 years. This was in Nature Genetics, completely secular journal, 1997. And you can imagine the kickback this guy got. I mean, people are just flooded this journal with editorials saying you are absolutely nuts, Anyways, so this type of research has been confirmed by both a creation scientist and the evolutionary conventional community. In other words, we have a single female ancestor going back 6,000 years, and we know from the Bible who that was. That was Eve. And I mentioned this study yesterday in some of my talks, but I left it in here because I think this is really cool, and I'll do this as quick as I can. But 2 papers were published in 2012 where they sequenced the protein coding regions of the human genome in thousands of people in North America in one study, thousands of people in the other study in Europe. They decided to publish at the same time so these papers would hit the press at the same time. And so they found out that within these protein coding regions, there were what they called rare variants, which are real mutations. So this isn't common variation built into Adam and Eve. These are real mutations within these protein coding regions. And over 80% of them were associated with heart disease, diabetes, cancer, birth defects, all of these things. So these were real mutations, and they weren't doing anything good whatsoever, but they were real mutations. And they calibrated these using the same empirical data that one group did that I just talked about with the mitochondrial DNA study in the 1990s, and these papers were published in 2012. And they came up with the exact same time frame. They came up with a time frame right there of about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago for the beginning of this DNA mutational variation, a biblical timeline, not with the mitochondrial DNA outside the nucleus, but with the genome, the genomic DNA inside the nucleus. And so we have all kinds of data now from genetics, from conventional evolutionary sources who did not calibrate their clocks with theoretical, fictional deep time, but used real empirical demographic data, and they came up with biblical timelines. Amazing, absolutely amazing. And of course, when we look, and this has been mentioned previously today and yesterday, human lifespans drastically declined after the flood. And this is because there was a genetic bottleneck at the flood. The world was repopulated by 3 breeding couples known as 3 sons and their wives. And lifespans, they were still pretty high immediately after the flood, but they just tanked, very quickly after that. And so a lot of that was probably due to the genetic buildup of mutations in the genome. And of course, there's environmental factors as well, because we believe the pre-flood conditions in the world were much more favorable to life. There was a lot more plant life that probably had all kinds of nutrients and things as well that was lost in the flood that people were eating and sustaining themselves with. But anyways, definitely the mutational load of humans has been building up ever since creation. Or I should say ever since the fall of Adam and Eve, which brought the curse of corruption into the world and into our genomes. So where do all the people groups come from? Well, all people groups share one original ancestral origin. But before I get into this part of the talk, I want to share a story with you. So my wife and I, probably at least 5 years ago, maybe 7 years ago now, we were visiting a church in the Dallas-Fort Worth region. Of course, there's hundreds of churches there. Anyways, we're visiting this one church on a Sunday night. It wasn't our regular church. And so we're visiting there, and we're kind of sitting towards the back, and there's a couple in front of us, kind of a young Asian couple, and they had a teenage daughter. And the teenage daughter was kind of distracted, and not really paying attention. And my wife was kind of felt a burden for that. And so after the service, my wife started talking to the teenage girl and her mother, which left the husband kind of free. And so I started talking to him. And he said, "Oh, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I work for the Institute for Creation Research, and I show how genetics and science supports the scriptures." And his eyes just got really big, and he goes, "Wow." And then he got this really confused look on his face, and he said, "I'm getting a PhD at Dallas Theological Seminary in Old Testament." And I'm going, "Okay." And he says, "I don't understand where all the different races come from." And I'm like, I didn't say this to him, but I'm like, "You're getting a PhD in Old Testament? and you don't know where all the races came from?" Because if you're in here and you're a creation scientist, you've probably heard this story ad nauseum, where all the different people groups come from. I don't like to call them races because that term originated with Huxley and Darwin and Haeckel, and these rascals that wrecked science for us, right? So, and that started the whole eugenics movement, for that matter, which I don't have time to get into, but that's a whole other presentation. So anyways, you know, the Apostle Paul was talking to a bunch of pagans in Greece, and he's evangelizing them, and of course they're probably, you're wondering, they've got their own weird ideas, you know, about where everyone came from, but the Apostle Paul said, as he's trying to describe the Creator and creation and where everything came from before he gets into the gospel, he says, and he, God, has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth. And that's the Greek word haima, which is literally blood. And so, how do we relate to that? Well, if you know anything about animal breeding, maybe you've got friends that breed dogs or cats or horses or something. We say pedigreed animals have bloodlines, right? Genetically related relatives, aunts, uncles, and cousins are called blood relatives. And all humans being of one blood just simply means one line of genetic descent, everyone going back to Adam and Eve. And so let's look at kind of the entire timeline of humans on the earth. So humans were created 6,000 years ago, and I think they fell in the garden shortly after that, bringing death, curse, and corruption on the earth and on humanity, and total depravity into humans. And the global flood then was about 4,300 years ago, and I've got 6 people here because the earth was repopulated in that genetic bottleneck there through Noah's 3 sons and their wives. And then we have the Tower of Babel, roughly about 4,000 years ago, and this is really key. And this is where we get the Table of Nations, or roughly about 70 main people groups. And here we are in 2026, a little over 8 billion people now on the face of the earth. So let's look at a couple of scriptures that literally address this human diversity. And in Genesis 9:18 through 19, it says, and the sons of Noah that went forth of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Ham is the father of Canaan. And these are the 3 sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. And then Genesis chapter 10, or what's known as the Table of Nations. These are the families, people groups of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. Look at this emphasis on the sons of Noah and their wives. Well, Nathaniel Jensen actually has looked at mitochondrial DNA in relation to the repopulation of the earth after the global flood. And so he did this with the human mitochondrial DNA, and he created what was called an unrooted tree, or an unrooted phylogeny, where if you root a phylogeny, you typically will stick some weird outgroup in at the bottom, like with humans, they do that with chimpanzees. But he did this because he wanted to look at the diversity of humans and when everything first branched off. And look what he found. He found 3 main branches of global human mitochondrial DNA going back to the 3 wives of Noah's sons. Remember, you inherit the mitochondrial DNA from your mother. So it's the maternal lineage. And he also did that with the Y chromosome. And contrary to what people are telling you today, if you have a Y chromosome, you are a man. And so Nathaniel Jensen also looked at the male lineage, and he found 3 main branches of Y chromosome DNA as well. So from both sides of the equation, the maternal side, the paternal side, we find 3 main branches of genetic descent, all based on the reality and truth of the scripture saying that earth was repopulated by 3 breeding couples. Isn't that amazing? So not only does science confirm the timeline of the Bible, it also confirms the repopulation of the earth after the global flood. In essence, indirectly confirming the global flood outside of geology. So anyways, the 3 sons of Noah as well line up there with the Y chromosome DNA. Well, let's look at where all the people groups came from, and the Bible tells us about this as well. So in Genesis 11, 1 through 9, now the whole earth had one language and one speech. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over all the face of the earth. And so all the human genetic diversity that we see today can be easily explained by the Tower of Babel. And getting back to my story about this guy from Dallas Theological Seminary who was a PhD student in the Old Testament, I explained this concept to him. I said, okay, this is where all, and he said races, but I said, this is where all the different people groups come from. And I explained the Tower of Babel and how that was biblically accurate and supported by science. And this is where all the people groups come from, because if your languages, there was one language before this event, and then all of a sudden God confuses their languages, and then we get scriptures about 70 main people groups or table of nations. And as it turns out, there was, and I explained this to this guy, and then he all you could see this sense of relief come across his face, you know, like, thank you. Well, why aren't this guy's professors telling him this stuff, you know? I mean, you're majoring in Old Testament? I'm like, wow. But, yeah, okay. Anyways. So, what's really interesting is that there have been studies done where they've actually looked at the different language, the main language groups, and they call these phenomes, and they have actually correlated phenomes with genomes and put the two together and found out they perfectly match and correlate with each other. In other words, the genomes of people are matching with the phenomes and their geographical locations and people groups around the world. And of course, now things are really kind of getting mixed up, because now you can fly across the world and be there in you know, less than a day. And people now, you know, they're migrating all over, and so it's becoming less and less now. But anyways, well, let's look at how this really sort of practically happened, and once again, how science supports this. So we've been talking about this the past couple of days, that in the global flood, the conditions were perfect to create a post-flood ice age, which lasted roughly about 700 years. And so the upper part of the earth, the northern parts of the earth, were covered in ice. And it was a providential ice age, by the way, because all of that water being sucked up into snow and ice created all these land bridges around the world, which you can actually see on Google Maps when they show you the places in the ocean where they're really shallow. You can actually see these land bridges. And so the ice age was providential in that it sucked up all this water, creating all these land bridges so that people could migrate and animals could migrate all over the world. And I actually have an article at ICR. It came out in our Acts and Facts magazine, but it's still on our website. And it's actually in my book, The Fossils Still Say No. And I call it the Providential Pleistocene, which is the era after the global flood. Providential in that God caused the ice age to occur so that people could spread all around the world. But look at this picture here. So the entire world is covered with a sheet of ice in the northern regions, and this is a modern map of current genetic diversity in the world. So the areas that are green have the highest genetic diversity in them currently. So the arc lands right there, where you see that red dot that just popped up. So what direction are people going to initially go? And that's where the Tower of Babel would have been, right there in that general region. So where do you think people are going to go? Are they going to just go up north? No, they're going to go where it's easier to live, right? So they're going to go into Africa and into Asia. And these are the areas with the highest current genetic diversity in the world. And then as you can see, as you get further out from that, there's less genetic diversity. So once again, science supports the migration of humans after the Tower of Babel. Isn't it great how science, when you look at it, just supports the entire biblical story in Genesis, from the creation to the dispersion of people groups? It's amazing. And so what about all the traits that make us different as humans? Well, things got, Gregor Mendel is known as the father of modern genetics, and he did discover some things that are helpful for us to understand heredity and how genes segregate and so forth. But he also kind of passed on this idea that one gene equals one trait. Nothing could be further from the truth. Well, how did that happen for him? Well, he had two true breeding parents, and it turns out that there was a mutation in these pea plants which messed up the anthocyanin biosynthesis pathway, which creates purple flowers, or that reddish purple coloring. And so, yes, that was a single gene trait because this anthocyanin pathway got messed up and it couldn't produce pigment, so you ended up with white plants that had two copies of that mutation, because you have two genomes in every cell in your body, one from your mother, one from your father. And so the same way with plants that are diploids. And so if you have a plant that has two bad copies of that mutated gene, you're going to get white flowers. But if you have a plant that has two copies of the good gene, they'll be purple, or even just one copy of the good gene, it'll be purple. And so that's how Darwin came up with these basic genetic ratios, which they still teach in high school and college biology and genetics classes. In fact, I'm an adjunct professor at Liberty University, and I don't have any say in creating the classes. I just have to teach, what I'm given. And they still teach us stuff in Biology 101. And so I have to review all these things called Punnett squares that students turn in. And so, but it gives this false idea, one gene, one trait. As it turns out, all the traits that we see in humans are polygenic. They're controlled by many genes, not a single gene. Your genome functions like computers do on a network. You could think of each computer as a gene, but in the internet, you're talking about hundreds of computers talking to each other in all these gateways and servers and things, and that's the way it works in the genome. Genes never function independently. In fact, they can't. It's impossible for them to do that. So what about this? Let's debunk some of these one gene, one trait ideas that were taught in the public schools. I remember when I was in high school, the teacher said, okay, everyone grab your ear and figure out if you have an attached earlobe or a free dangling earlobe. Yeah, go ahead and touch your ears. And so we were taught, and of course I've got an attached earlobe, and the teacher said, if you have an attached earlobe, that's recessive. Or if it's dangling, that's dominant. And well, it turns out that's not true at all. A paper was published in the journal, the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2017. The name of the paper was the Multi-Ethnic GWAS, stands for Genome-Wide Association Studies. So in other words, at this point in time, they have sequenced human genomes, thousands of them all over the world, and then you can correlate all these genomes with the particular traits that each human has. And so they say in this paper, the meta-analysis across all four cohorts, which is just study groups, and so one of the study groups, say, was Europe, the other was North America, the other would be the Middle East, so on, revealed a total of 49 significant loci, not all the ones that were minor loci, but just the major ones. So much for the one gene, one trait thing on the earlobe thing we're all taught, right? What about this thing called the Asian eye? Well, that is all due to what's called an epicanthic fold, or an epicanthus is a skin fold of the upper eyelid that covers the inner corner of the eye, which creates that Asian eye effect. Well, that word Asian eye is somewhat of a misnomer, but of course we see Asian eyes all over Asia, but we also see them in other places in the world that aren't Asian. So the San peoples of southern Africa have these Asian eyes, and they're not anywhere near Asia. And what's really crazy is you have this people group called the Swedish Sami, which are in upper Finland, upper Norway, upper Sweden, upper Russia, in that corner there. I've got a little map there, and they are blonde-haired, blue-eyed with Asian eyes. Crazy, huh? So you can see how all these traits of humans can get distributed across the globe just because of the confusion of languages at Babel. What about this whole concept of skin color? And so skin color is determined by the amount of melanin, which is a pigment, and the more melanin you have in your skin, the darker your skin will be. And so the way to measure that is not to measure anything on the outside of your arm, but to actually measure the melanin content in your armpit, which doesn't have any sun rays hitting it. And so that's exactly what they did in Africa. And this picture is actually from the journal paper that was published. And the name of the paper is Loci Associated, a locus or loci are just simply chromosomal locations around the genome. It could be a gene, it could be a regulatory element. And so associated with skin pigmentation identified in African populations. Well, that map I showed you earlier, where's the greatest human genetic diversity on Earth? Africa, right? So where are you going to do a study like this? In Africa. And so in Africa, they have every shade of skin color you can possibly imagine. What a perfect place to do that. And so for a little over 1,500 people, they measured the melanin in their armpits and also sequenced their genomes. And this is what and right there, Africa is the continent with the most diversity, so that's where that was done. So anyways, this is the various locations around Africa they actually took data from, and they actually also went into the Middle East there as well. And so what they found was that there were 6 different genes, major genes, that accounted for about 30% of the observed skin color variation. So 6 genes only accounted for 30% of the variation. In other words, there were hundreds of other minor genes that contributed to skin color. So skin color is a very complex polygenic trait. And so you can see how you can get all this human diversity in skin color all over the earth. In fact, here's a perfect example. So these are 2 Nigerian people that were living in the United Kingdom in England, and they had a baby that was very light-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed. And so they checked out the genetics of this whole situation and found out there wasn't anything weird going on, no hanky-panky going on here. That was their real biological child. And it turns out that the skin color genes and combinations there were in their parents' genomes, but they were just kind of hidden. And so they all, with the recombination of all these regions in the genome and the formation of gametes or sperm and eggs, and then in the fertilization process, everything was just right for all of these different genes to come together to create this very different phenotype than the parents. And so in my thinking, I think this is probably what happened at the Tower of Babel. You've got different shades of skin color of people, and this is a great example here. So this lady is a white European. She has blue eyes, light-skinned, and her husband is half Jamaican, but he's got some African genetic ancestry in there with a lot of dark skin genes. And so these are their 3 children. And look at the variation in all of these children in skin color. Well, let's look a little bit closely on 2 of them who are fraternal twins. These are not identical twins where they develop from the same egg, but they develop from a different fertilization events. But look at the variation there just between these 2 brothers. One is very dark-skinned and dark eyes, the other blonde-haired, blue-eyed. And so you can see how easily it would be for all these different people groups after the confusion of languages to develop. But what's the evolutionary study for skin color? Let's debunk this just to kind of wrap things up here. So according to evolutionists, and they look at us like we're just animals, and so they apply this natural selection nonsense to us like we're just a herd of animals. But anyways, they claim, lighter-skinned people with less melanin would be selected against in the tropics, but favored at higher latitudes. Well, then this news article comes out Inuits live in very cold climates. Why do they have dark skin? Completely running counter to the whole stupid evolutionary story. Well, the reason Inuits with dark skin live in northern latitudes is because they want to, right? Volitionally, they chose to go up there and live, and as a people group and repopulate there, and they are doing quite fine. But really, when we look at the scientific data, it completely debunks this selectionist nonsensical paradigm of skin color. So this is the worldwide incidence of melanoma by age. And so when does melanoma really start popping up in human populations? Well, it's after the ages of 15 to 39. When are women the most fertile and you have the most children? Below the age of 40 for the most part, right? Well, is the mythical, magical thing of natural selection doing anything at that point? No, it can't, right? Because there's no skin cancer manifesting at that point. People can have kids just fine. Well, it turns out skin cancer doesn't start popping up till very late in life. So the scientific data doesn't even support that ridiculous evolutionary paradigm they try and tag onto humans as far as skin color goes. But I just want to wrap up with this scripture. Because you know what the devil meant for evil, God meant for good, right? And so look at this scripture from the book of Revelation. John, the Apostle John, is actually given a vision of heaven and what's going on up there with all the humans that have gotten saved and that are up there. And it says, after this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude, which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hand. How could this have ever happened if people had not rebelled, inspired by Satan after the flood, to stay in one place against God's command, and then God had to go down there and confuse their languages? Well, guess what? Here we have the reason for that. You know, when Joseph made that comment that became a very popular scripture, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Now, we could apply that to a lot of things, and certainly here. So when we get to heaven, we're going to see all this human diversity. And where did all that come from? The Tower of Babel, right? By God's sovereign hand to go down there and confuse the language of a bunch of rebellious humans. So, anyways, praise God for that. I think I need a drink of water. Anyways, excuse me. At least I made it through. So, Chimps and Humans. This is a book that I wrote where I cover in excruciating detail every aspect of all the DNA paradigms that evolutionists try and use to claim human evolution from a chimp. Another book on the design and complexity of the cell. That title speaks for itself. The fossils still say no. I actually gave a talk on that book, The Paleontology of the Global Flood, yesterday, and I'll be doing that again for the youth today. So that's a fairly recent book, and that will really help you sort out why we see what we see in the fossil record and why we see them where we see them. So anyways, so that I would definitely recommend getting that book. That goes really well with Dr. Timothy Clary's book on Carved in Stone, which is a description of the rock record and the progressive nature of the global flood based on geological data taken from oil wells, rock outcrops, seismic data, all this geological data put into software where he reconstructed the entire global flood. Absolutely amazing work. And so that book's actually kind of piggybacks on his research there. Oops. And then, of course, we have this Creation Basics and Beyond. It's just got a little bit of everything in it, kind of a one-stop place for information on creation science in general. So we have a Discovery Center in Dallas. If you can get down there, I would try and visit that. A lot of high-tech exhibits, a planetarium, all kinds of stuff for all ages of people, even children. It's just a great place to visit. And so I would definitely recommend getting there. We have a bi-monthly magazine that you can get every 2 months. It's a beautiful, glossy magazine, absolutely free. And articles in there by the scientists that we publish in there. A lot of times, our articles that end up being in books end up here first. So if you get that, then you kind of get the first view of what later ends up being a book. So anyways, and you can also get a PDF of that if you just want to look at that on your tablet. And so here is a QR code if you want to scan. To sign up for the Acts and Facts magazine, we also have a daily devotional that comes out twice a year. And most of the articles in there, they're very short, only 300 words each roughly. And they only take about 5 minutes to read. But they integrate a lot of creation science with biblical theology, sound biblical theology, I might add. And most of them are by Henry Morris II, who was the founder of ICR and just an absolute genius and incredible man of God, who is also a very good theologian as well. So anyways, that is it. And I guess we're close to 1 o'clock, so...